Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for being with me today. Today, I have a very, very special guest with us. He's a U.S. Army Colonel, retired, Dr. Douglas MacGregor. He's obviously, you already know he's a very uh, famous analyst, expert on military history, expert in geopolitics. He was also a former advisor to the Secretary of Defense in the first Trump administration. So we have the great honor of having Colonel Dr. MacGregor with us. Sir, good morning, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Well, Ron, thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, sir. Sir, my first question, what is going on with Russia? What is going on with Russia and Ukraine? We came with the perspective that Trump won the elections. The neocons and the globalists they have this weird idea of inciting World War III will be removed and a new policy will come. We were very happy and inspired the moment that Zelensky came to Washington, D.C., and Trump actually kicking out of the White House. Okay, this is going to be the end of the war. We are not going to be facing more provocation. We're not going to be facing more escalation. Thanks God, we're not going to be facing the nightmare of a possible potential nuclear World War III. But suddenly, in the last 3, 4 months, everything has been backwards. Trump is perfectly aligned with the neocons, perfectly aligned. It looks like aligned with Lindsey Graham, with Cotton, with Senator Kennedy, with all the Fox News neocons. What is going on over there, sir?
Well, I guess you're answering, or rather, you're raising a question that's on everybody's mind at the moment. Large numbers of us went out and voted for President Trump because he appeared to favor policies that we thought would be a dramatic departure from what we had experienced under President Biden. Remember, President Trump promised everyone that he could end the war in 24 hours. All he had to do was pick up the phone and so forth. I always thought that was nonsense, but I did believe that he would take steps to disengage us from the war in Ukraine. It hasn't happened. Now, why? That's a complex question, but let's explain right up front what Ukraine means and does not mean to Americans. Ukraine is not strategically vital to the United States in any way. We have no significant strategic interest in Ukraine proper or Eastern Ukraine. We have no more interest in what happens in Ukraine than, say, we would have in what happens in Argentina or Uruguay or Paraguay. We want to get along with those states. We want to do business with those states, but we have no strategic interest that would involve military intervention under any circumstances in those areas. Well, the same thing is true in Ukraine. There's no reason for us to be there. Now, President Trump, I think, understood that we had been on a collision course with Russia for some time. I think he noted that during his first term, but he was unable to make any progress. When he was finally elected in 2024, he seemed to want to return to the mission of improving relations with Russia. That doesn't seem to have gone very well for very long. And I think you have to look at the people that surround President Trump. Who are they? What are their thinking? What are their thoughts? What are their positions on foreign affairs? And sometimes I refer to the current White House as the New York City delegation, since virtually everybody is from New York City. These are neoconservatives, if you want to call them that. They're indistinguishable from the globalists that we all learned to detest under President Biden. They seem to be committed to this war in Ukraine for reasons that are important to them, but not to the rest of us. We have no interest in war with Russia under any circumstances. A war with Russia would be devastating. It would be devastating to us. It would be devastating to Europe. It would be devastating to Russia. Makes no sense at all. There's no reason why we should be in conflict with Russia. But the so-called New York City delegation that currently sits in the White House is pushing President Trump down that road, and he seems to have obliged. And I think the larger question is, why did President Trump change his position 180 degrees? How could he go from saying, I don't want this war. It's not my war, and I want to end this war, to, well, it's still not my war when it is. It's his 100% now. He owns it. And I want to end the war. But in order to end the war, the Russians effectively have to get on their knees, beg for forgiveness, surrender everything that they own, and promise to be our good and loyal friends forever. Well, Ron, that's not going to happen.
No,
That's nonsense. And I don't think that Mr. Witkoff, who was in Russia today, in fact, as I understand it, he's now left the Kremlin. He's probably on his way back here. I doubt very seriously that he learned anything or was able to make any progress, because our position and all of our positions regarding Ukraine, as far as the Russians are concerned, are unacceptable. Now, let's put it this way. Let us imagine that Mexico suddenly became a place where, say, the Chinese had set up shop. In other words, in addition to the large Chinese intelligence apparatus down in Mexico, you now had a Chinese military presence as well as intelligence presence, and Chinese military equipment poured into Mexico. And over the space of several years, it became very obvious that the Chinese were assisting in the buildup and formation of a Mexican War of Liberation Army, an army that would march north and liberate all the oppressed Mexicans that live in California, Arizona, Mexico, and Texas. How would we respond to this? Well, I think we all know how we would respond. Uh, right after we launched B-52s and large quantities of rocket artillery and artillery ammunition, we would go in on the ground to root this danger out and demand its removal. And we would tell the Chinese to get the hell out. So I think the Russians are in a very similar position right now. They see what has happened in eastern Ukraine, certainly early on in Budapest, rather Bucharest in 2008. You had this very unfortunate meeting where we forced everyone in NATO to sign on for Ukraine as a future member of NATO. And even at the time, Merkel, who was certainly a globalist and no friend of the United States, nevertheless pointed out this was a bad idea. Even she could see that far in advance. But it didn't make any difference. We continued down this road. In the meantime, the CIA, some of your friends that you worked with there, established themselves in Kiev and helped to stage and organize a coup, obviously with the help of MI6, and increasingly see a lot of evidence that the Mossad was involved. And what you get out of this is a government which is unambiguously anti-Russian, hostile to Russia, hostile to anything the Russians care about, and is radically nationalist, at least on the surface, and determined to build up a force that will eventually attack Russia. In fact, as soon as the coup was over, the Ukrainian force that did exist at the time began attacking Donetsk and Luhansk, where the Russian population in eastern Ukraine was largely concentrated, with artillery, killing large numbers of civilians. In fact, by the time this Russian military intervention occurs, over 14,000 people in those areas had been killed by the Ukrainians. So the Russians watched this, and they thought that we were negotiating in good faith when they came to visit with us and the Germans and the French and others at the Minsk Accords. These Minsk Accords promised all sorts of things. They promised equality before the law for Russians inside Ukraine. It promised Russian citizens equal treatment by the Ukrainian government, so forth. All of that went quickly by the wayside. And then subsequently, once again, Mrs. Merkel told us the truth, later on seconded by Mr. Macron, that the Minsk Accords were simply there to buy time to build up this Ukrainian army for the eventual assault on Russia. Because the idea behind the army was that they would reconquer, if you will, or retake these two rogue provinces, which were Russian, and they would also turn on Crimea, even though historically Crimea has no relationship with Ukraine at all. Nevertheless, they were going to retake Crimea.
right. Sir,
Well, this culminates then in this 2022 intervention that even then comes after several proposals from Moscow for Ukrainian neutrality and a different solution that would avoid the war. And there was no interest in acquiring Ukrainian territory whatsoever. Now, the reason I bring all this up is that when I was at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe, this is from 1998 until well, November of 97 until January of 2000, the attitude towards Ukraine was that Ukraine had an important mission. It was going to be neutral and it was going to provide hundreds of miles, in other words, 700 miles between the eastern border of NATO in Poland and any Russian military power. In other words, the great contribution the Ukrainians were going to make was by being neutral and avoiding any conflict with Russia, which was something that at the time, in 2000, everyone in NATO was interested in avoiding. No one wanted a war with Russia. So here we are, this whole thing fell apart. We're being told lie after lie after lie, day after day after day about how terrible the Russians are, which in reality is very untrue. And if you look at the true record, Ukrainian forces have done terrible things to Russian prisoners, Russian civilians, and the Ukrainian regime kills Russian civilians every time they have an opportunity to use a long-range strike weapon. They attack Russian civilians in Russian cities and neighborhoods. My point is that this thing is about to end within the next 3 or 4 months. I don't think there will be very much of Ukraine left. But instead of simply saying, look, we have no interest here. We don't want a war with Russia. And so if I were President Trump, would say I'm withdrawing all U.S. personnel in and out of uniform, intelligence, civilian, whatever, out of Ukraine, period. We're getting out. We're going to suspend all deliveries of any military equipment under any circumstances. However, we will provide humanitarian assistance to the Ukrainian population that has suffered in this war through a third country. Those things could be done. And at that point, when you make that kind of announcement, the Russians are going to take you seriously and you have a real chance to negotiate an immediate end to the conflict. We refuse to do that. What we've just done is promise more equipment, more weapons, more ammunition. And as a friend of mine over at Raytheon, who's been involved with missiles for years, said, we're now promising the Ukrainians 17 minutes of air and missile defense if we ever deliver the batteries and the missiles and the radars that we've promised to send that won't arrive until sometime next year. So the stupidity, the foolishness, the nonsense continues. And it's reached a point now where the Russians don't believe anything we say. They don't believe anything that President Trump says. He's contradicted himself too many times. He's promised and then failed to deliver. And it looks to them like the only thing that President Trump is interested in are the optics of success, that he can stand in front of the American people and claim that he created peace where there was none, end conflicts, and so forth. And he takes credit for ending conflicts all over the place with which he had almost nothing to do. So the Russians are not fooled. They know what they're dealing with. This is one of the great marketing geniuses of all time, but they're not taking him seriously in the least.
No, so sad because, I mean, again, we have good hopes when he came into power and he put some good people over there. I mean, J.D. Vance, I think he has some good vision. I mean, with limitation, obviously, but good visions about this. And he put Tulsi Gabbard, who has, and she demonstrated good visions and good understanding about how dangerous this is. I mean, a nuclear war with Russia, World War III, do what the neocons want. But in the other hand, I mean, this is like a little angel and a little devil. I see that he goes golfing with Lindsey Graham, the famous senator, and immediately, yeah, he takes a tough line against Russia, and then all his friends on the Senate write to him or call him, and oh yes, I think he does whatever the last person talks to him. That's the vision
Well,
he takes. Yeah.
Ron, you're making a good point, and that's something which some of us observed during the first term, that he is frequently most influenced by the last person he talked to, which is not a good thing. But let's face it, President Trump was someone with a lot of experience in marketing based on his real estate background. And then, of course, he went into the, what do they call it, reality TV game, and he learned how to manipulate images and perceptions and thinking. But beyond that, this is not someone who has studied anything or learned anything about the world that he lives in. In other words, he doesn't really know much about the world beyond his borders. In other words, beyond the borders of the United States. Now, he certainly visited golf courses around the world, and he's drunk champagne and other things at parties with wealthy people overseas. But in terms of really understanding what people think or what they're interested in beyond our borders, I don't think he knows much about it. So he's easily influenced. The other thing is, I believe he thinks this is 1991. He thinks he has a set of armed forces that we no longer have. The armed forces today are very anachronistic and I would say antiquated in many respects. And we've needed a desperate overhaul in defense for at least 3 decades after Desert Storm. But the point is that he doesn't have the armed forces he once had, and the American population is different from what it was 34, 35 years ago. He doesn't seem to have come to terms with that either. So there is no discernible strategy that he's pursuing. The strategic goals are unclear, other than a great moment with the media and an opportunity to market himself and his administration. There doesn't seem to be a definable goal. Simply standing up there and saying, well, I want peace. Well, that's fine. What are you doing to get it? And if you're insisting that everyone essentially bow down and kiss your rear end in order to have peace, that's an unrealistic strategy. And I think that's about where we are. And when we go to the Middle East, we see a lot of the same thing. You know, I want this tragedy in Gaza to end. Well, that's noble. We're very happy you want it to end. What are you doing to stop it? I
Yes.
mean, these are the problems.
Yes.
So it's not a question, do I like President Trump or not? No, of course I like him. I think he's a nice person. I enjoyed the few discussions I had with him, and I thought he was pretty level-headed and reasonable. But as you point out, he's changed in a lot of ways. He's changed in his attitudes, and I think you have to attribute it to what I mentioned earlier, the New York City administration, because the people that surround him are New York City people. Their background is in finance. These are not production capitalists. Musk is a production capitalist. He builds something. As a result of building something, people are employed, if you understand what I mean.
Yes, sir.
This is not someone who profits exclusively from transaction fees, you know,
I
buying, selling companies, selling off their assets, plundering them. That was Mitt Romney. Well, you've got a lot of people like that surrounding President Trump. There's not a real understanding of what a powerful, sound economic foundation is. And a lot of our economic strength has been whittled away. It's been lost. It's dissipated over the last 3 decades because the CEO classes, in other words, the people that own shares in companies and the people that run companies, saw fit to export our manufacturing base overseas. You know, China didn't rob us of anything. We shipped things to China. Now we're shipping things to Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, once again in search of cheap labor. I don't know that he really grasps all of that. And I don't know that he has the strength or the determination to reverse any of it. And again, he also has to deal with Congress, and I'm not sure he's ever really learned how to do that. So instead of seeing decisive moves in a strategic direction anywhere, we see President Trump who changes his position, says one thing one day and another thing the next. I mean, that was just today. Bloomberg published something about tariffs. And President Trump said he was going to impose 100% tariffs on anybody who did business with Russia. Well, now he says, no, that may not be the case. And by the way, I never said that. You know, no, I'm afraid you did, President Trump. That was a very dumb remark, but yes, you said it. And say, now I'm going to impose 100% tariffs on China, 100% tariffs on Japan, 100% tariffs on Korea because they are doing business with Russia, because they buy oil and gas from Russia along with other raw materials and resources. It's impractical. It doesn't make any sense. So the whole tariff war has exploded in our faces. And tariffs are usually imposed for defense, you know, Ron. You're trying to defend a fledgling industry, to nourish it, to help it grow, cultivate it. We don't use tariffs normally as offensive weapons, which is what he's done. But there's this underlying, I think, theme with President Trump that bullying works, threatening works. No, it doesn't.
That's perhaps his personality. But sir, two questions. This frustration that Trump has with Putin, he say it out loud. I'm frustrated with Putin. Number one, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think that the frustration of Trump comes out of non-realistic goals. He thought perhaps that having Putin on the phone a couple times, he will use his charisma, his magnetism, his personality to persuade Putin to surrender, because he's the master of negotiations. And after he gets in on the phone a few times, Putin will surrender, stop, and leave, and whatever. And Putin obviously is not going to do that. So I think that's the core of the root of the frustration of Trump, that his Jedi powers of magnetism and personality and charisma are not working with Putin. And number two, I believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that all these neocon effort that we saw during the last 3 years of destroying Russia comes out of a very false narrative and a very false conception of this war. They believe that this war for Russia is an optional war, like Vietnam was for the United States, or like Afghanistan was for the United States, that if everything goes okay, we stay, but if everything is not okay, then we pack and we go home, and that's it. I think the neocons fail to see that this is a critical existential war for Russia, a must-win war for Russia, and Russia will not surrender and pack and go home. That they will keep going and going and going, because the existence of Russia depends on this. I mean, the plan of the neocons, according to what I have seen, please correct me, is that they wanted to bankrupt Russia with the sanctions, do a soft coup, color revolution, put a Navalny kind of a puppet over there in Moscow, and then break Russia into 15 little countries. That's it. Russia is done. And they failed to understand that that's not the Putin's Russia. This is a critical existential war, a must-win war for Russia. What do you think about this concept of the neocons? What do you think about this frustration of Trump with Putin?
Well, two things, Ron. First of all, your first point is very accurate. None of this is about personality. You've heard President Trump say, well, I had a good relationship with Mr. Xi, and I don't know what's happened. And I had a good personal relationship with Putin. I don't know what's happened. This is not about personal relationships. This is about interests. Both Putin and Xi represent the national interests of Russia and China, respectively. So if you're talking about President Putin, when you sit down to talk to his delegation, they have a set of specific national security interests that led them to intervene in Ukraine and will lead them to continue to do what they're doing in Ukraine until those national security interests are satisfied. So it has nothing to do with personality. It has nothing to do with how good or how bad a negotiator President Trump is. It has everything to do with interests. Has President Trump and has his team sat down with him and defined what those national security interests are for Russia? Does he know those? Does he understand those? Does he understand what's negotiable and what is absolutely unconditional? I don't think he does. What are our national security interests? That's the other point. What are they? What are we pursuing in Ukraine? Now, that's part of the second point that you made. Ever since the late 1990s and the early part of this century, there has been a strategy in Washington designed to break up, weaken, and destroy Russia as a national entity. Now, why? Well, again, I think the New York City delegation is full of people that understand this, because they are part and parcel of the group that went over to Russia when Russia was weak after the Soviet Union fell apart and tried essentially to rape it, steal its resources, steal its capabilities. And then finally, once Putin took over and began to reverse this tendency, restore Russia's, let's say, economic prosperity and national security, these people grew very angry because they wanted not only to rape Russia of its resources, they wanted to remove its government, they wanted to break Russia up into smaller parts. Now, why would they want to do this? Because if you can break Russia up and Russia doesn't have a strong central government, you can get access to what some people think, you have 40 or 50 trillion dollars in natural resources. So when the whole Ukraine thing got underway, it was not simply about Ukraine. In fact, I would argue no one really gave a damn from the very beginning of what happened to Ukraine. Ukraine was just a useful battering ram with which to attack Russia. In other words, we were going to do everything short of direct war to destroy Russia. Well, Ron, that's failed. That whole strategy has failed miserably. That's over. Right now, it's a question of what the Russians are going to do next. And frankly, I think they'll roll up everything to the Dnieper River, and then they'll look for some sort of response from the Europeans, specifically from the people on Ukraine's borders. If there's no response, if there's no willingness to sit down with the Russians and come to some sort of arrangement for Ukrainian neutrality, then I think the Russians will continue to move. They'll move on Kiev, they'll move on Odessa, and if they have to, they'll move all the way to the Polish border, which is very unfortunate because they don't want to. They don't want anything to do with ruling Western Ukrainians. The people out in Western Ukraine have been
Certainly.
anti-Russian for hundreds of years. Insane. They don't want anything to do with it.
Yes.
And we this would be analogous to we fought a war with Mexico and then decided we were going to rule everything all the way to Mexico City. Are we insane? That's stupid. That can't be done. If it is done, it'll be a terrible mistake. We'll pay heavily for the price. The Russians understand this. We need to back off. But again, who has sat down and explained any of this to President Trump? What does he understand? And frankly, he may not care because the people who are driving his train are the donors, the billionaires who elected him to office, because he had to make deals with billionaires to help get him elected. And those billionaires are caught up in the what I call New York City administration. And I don't think he has much wiggle room.
Sir, at one point, and again, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I think Russia did not want this big war or total war or anything like that. This was, according to why I see it, this was what the Prussians call a cabinet Krieg, a very limited war, a very specific war that immediately will end via negotiation, the negotiation that happened in March 2022 in Istanbul, in Turkey. And they were about to end the war just 3 weeks after it
Well,
started.
Ron, you're 100% right. And just consider this. Everyone has insisted from the beginning that President Trump, I say everyone, I'm talking about the people in Washington and London and Paris primarily, and to a lesser extent, Berlin, that Russia harbors this goal of conquering Europe. Now, when the Russians went into eastern Ukraine, they discovered several things. They discovered that the threat to them was far greater than they had ever anticipated. In other words, that this Ukrainian army was far larger and more dangerous and better equipped and better trained than they thought. Secondly, they had no idea that we had set up 23, 24 biolabs inside Ukraine that were conducting various forms of genetic research with the goal of developing bioweapons designed to kill Slavic people. I mean, that's insane, but that's the sort of thing that was going on. Now, once they discovered that, they then also discovered something about themselves. The Russian army was too small because the Russian army was really designed for border defense. That wasn't going to work. They needed a much larger, more capable, more robust force. And so they move during 2022 into the fall and they go to a strategic defense. In other words, they move forward to the areas they consolidate that they'd seized, consolidate, they build strategic defenses, and they spend the next 12 months after that essentially building up the Russian military establishment so that it can take the offensive and destroy the enemy. What happens is that thanks to the terrible advice that the Ukrainians received from our senior officers, British and American, they tried to attack this strategic defense, something for which they were completely unprepared. They didn't understand how technology had changed. They tried to apply the old tactics that probably would have worked in the 1990s, but have no chance of working anymore. And so the Ukrainians took terrible losses. Today, after almost 4 years of war, Ukrainians have lost an estimated 1.8 million killed. Ukrainian soldiers killed. The Russians have lost about 120,000. Then you have another 10, 15, 20,000 who've been killed who were Chechens, who have been a very important and effective component part of the Russian military, along with many of the people living in Luhansk and Donetsk who were volunteers who joined to fight. If you look at the disparity in those losses, 1.8 million killed in action versus, say, 120 to 130 or 35,000 killed on the Russian side, what does that reflect? Differences in technology, differences in tactics, differences in training. So the Russians have moved slowly because Putin did not want to take heavy casualties. He wanted a trained and equipped force that was ready to fight, and he would send them into action. And they've tried to rotate people in and out of action. You, as a former soldier, understand very well that after 6 months in the line fighting an enemy, you need a break. It's mental health as well as physical health. The Russians have done a good job of that, but the Ukrainians have not. The Ukrainians have simply sent millions into the meat grinder. We think that at least 1 million to 2 million have been wounded, and most of them will never return to duty, whereas the wounded on the Russian side, more than half of them were returned to duty after they were properly cared for. Right now, the Ukrainian army has no means of evacuating anybody quickly.
Marco Rubio said on their oath on the Senate. I don't know if you remember, but a few months ago he said, "Ukraine is running out of Ukrainians."
Of
He
course.
said, yeah,
Of
a
course.
little bit of truth came out, a little bit of truth, but actually truth.
Well, now we're talking about battalions of boys and old men. You know, President Trump was asked, "Are you aware of the new law that Mr. Zelensky has now passed?" And he's announced that they're going to take men over the age of 60. And President Trump says, "No, I'm unaware of that." Well, I find that very hard to believe. And if he really gave a damn about the human beings living in eastern Ukraine, this would stop. And as I said, it's very easy to stop. You do exactly what I outlined, and have been saying this for over almost 4 years. You get everybody out who's an American. You stop the delivery of military assistance and aid. Then you offer humanitarian assistance to the ones who are there. Once you do that, then you can sit down and have a rational discussion with the Russians about what are your legitimate national security interests, because they have legitimate interests. We have legitimate interests. You know, we have legitimate interests in what happens over the border in Mexico. We have legitimate interest in what happens over the border in Canada. The Canadians and the Mexicans have legitimate interests. You've got to sit down and figure out what they are. Once you know those, you can craft a solution, a settlement.
Yeah.
But you can't walk in as a bully and try to shove your view of the world down someone else's throat.
or,
And that's
or
what Trump's been doing.
or use his so-called superpowers of personality to persuade Putin to surrender. And again, sir, this war was about to end in March, in late March 2022.
Yes.
And it was Boris Johnson, it was Biden, Boris Johnson flew to Kiev to talk to Zelensky and persuade him to keep going with the war. They are the one who converted this cabinet creek into a false creek, into a total war to the end. It was not Russia. Russia wanted to end this war 2 weeks, 3 weeks after it started in 2022. But let's see, the ultimatum that Trump gave to Putin is about to be finished by tomorrow. What do you think will happen now that the ultimatum is not going to happen? Is not going to happen now that India is going to keep buying oil from Russia. What do you think is going to happen during the next week, sir?
I don't think anything of significance is going to occur. I think the Russians have essentially turned off the receivers, if you will. They'll be polite to us. I'm sure they were polite to Mr. Witkoff, although he represents much of what they truly detest, which is this New York City delegation running the White House. But nevertheless, I'm sure they were polite to him. Witkoff's an intelligent man. I'm sure he delivered what he was asked to deliver. But nothing will happen. The Russians are going to continue until they have achieved their aims. Now, we know what those aims are. They have nothing to do with conquering Ukraine. They're going to annihilate the Ukrainian military establishment that is opposed to them. They want to remove this hateful neo-Nazi government in Kiev. That's very clear. And they want Ukraine to be neutral. They would like to see elections held in what is effectively a future neutral Ukraine, and see a new government emerge in Kiev, because they certainly can't do business with Zelensky or anybody associated with him. And if we and our British friends try to use the CIA and MI6 to install a new puppet, that's not going to work. Russia's not going to tolerate that. You know, that would essentially be the same, as I was saying earlier, if the Chinese or the Russians installed a puppet who promises to remain hostile to the United States into power in Mexico City. Forget it. It's unacceptable. It would never work. So I think this tragedy is going to end, but it's going to end in spite of us. And I think somebody said the other day to me, "Well, what happens when it ends?" And I said, "Well, what did we do at the end of the Vietnam War?" And he said, "Well, what do you mean?" I said, "We stopped talking about it. We walked away. No one wanted to discuss it. No one stood up and said, 'I'm sorry, I was wrong. I'm responsible for the debacle in Vietnam.'" Nobody does that. No generals were held accountable. We now have a four-star in Europe who was mightily responsible for a major river crossing amphibious operation against the Russians that killed hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers in the space of a couple of hours. He's now a four-star. He's the same man who was a co-architect of the disastrous withdrawal from Kabul in Afghanistan. He was a two-star then who had no business doing what he was doing. Now he's a four-star.
I
I'm
was there.
saying,
I was in Kabul many
yeah.
times, many times. I was there with the Afghan police. Sir, last question about Russia. I talked to my friends in Europe. I was stationed in Europe, and I make a lot of friendships in Europe, and I live in Europe. Also, after I left the army, I lived over there for many years, and I talked to a lot of European friends, and they are so hypnotized by the media, by Deutsche Welle, by the Frankfurter Allgemein, by Le
Right.
Monde, by all these Televisión Española, Radio Televisión Italiana. They see all this day and night, and they all talk to me, and they are all afraid that as soon as Russia conquer and destroy all Ukraine, Russia immediately is going to jump and go all the way to Paris, and in Berlin is gone. They're going to destroy Berlin again, like they did in 45, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What would you say to these friends of mine that are just a representative, I'm sure, of a very, very large population of Europe? They are so scared that after Ukraine, like dominoes, Russia is going to roll over all the way to Berlin and Frankfurt and Paris and Rome, et cetera, et cetera. What will you tell to these people that, because I have failed in years trying to explaining them that this is absolute nonsense. What would you say to these people in 30 seconds, sir?
Well, I think they've been lied to, and they continue to be lied to. And it's time for them to wake up and understand that if everyone in the media and everyone in the government are all saying the same thing, there's something radically wrong. There's no diversity of opinion. Everybody talks about racial diversity, for God's sakes. I'm less worried about that than I am worried about diversity of thinking. And right now in Europe, that's being crushed. These governments that are sitting in Berlin and Paris and London need to go away. The populations in those countries need to remove them. I think that will happen. But telling people that what they're being told is wrong is something that they're going to have to figure out. They don't have the advantage of alternative media the way we do. You represent alternative media. You can speak freely and you're sending an important message. They don't have that right now in great numbers inside Germany or France. And you would think, given the experience that Germany had that ended badly 80 years ago, they would be very concerned about preserving free speech. The opposite is the case. The government is working overtime with the media to crush it, to suppress it. They're going to have to fix that. We can't do that for them. But I think one of the things that we will do sooner rather than later is we will pack up and leave Europe. And that's because we can't afford to stay there, just as we cannot afford to stay in Asia either. Maintaining these vast ground forces and air forces overseas on bases in other people's countries is just not practical. And more important, it doesn't make any sense anymore in the world that we live in with given technology and the nature of the world we're in. One of the things that we don't seem to get, you mentioned India. And I keep telling people, they talk about BRICS oh, it's a big threat. Well, first of all, BRICS arose in response to us and how we've been doing business in the world. But I said, look at these countries. Look at Brazil. Look at India. Look at China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam. How many people live in these countries? Start adding up the numbers. Pretty soon, you find that's more than half of the world's population. Does that make a difference? You're damn right it does. We don't seem to understand that. We are one country in the world. We have to come to terms with the reality that we are just one, and that we have to learn to adapt and get along with others. Instead of that, we're back to the Trump problem. It's I'm going to beat you down. I'm going to punish you I'm going to threaten you. I'm going to invade you or bomb you if you don't do what I want. That's not a reasonable solution. It's not workable anymore.
No, no. I mean, you cannot intimidate Modi with tariff or sanctions. And Modi was very clear to send a list back to Trump. This is how you are financing the war. This is what you are buying from the Russians. Why are you so angry about we defending Indian national interest and buying oil? And one last thing, Colonel, before I do the last question about Israel, my friends and the people I hear in Europe, they still think and they still believe that Russia is this Soviet Union part two, this communist force, this communist imperialism, if you want to call it. And they haven't realized that the Russia of today is so different from the Soviet Union of the 80s, and that the Russian Orthodox Church have basically replaced the ideological foundation of the Russian state, that communism was out. It's a minority party, it's an opposition party, and the Russian Christianity have been filling the gap of the foundation of the state. And that's something that people don't understand. Why is so people so ignorant or blind, if you want to call, about this basic fact of history? Even Pence, Vice President Pence, a few years ago, say because Russia did this to Hungary and Russia did this to the Czech Republic, and it was Vivek Ramaswamy who have to correct him. I'm sorry, Vice President Pence, it was not Russia, it was the Soviet Union, communist Soviet Union. It was not the Christian Orthodox Russia of today. So why is people so blind to this basic fact of history?
Well, I think there are two things. One is the poor quality of education in the United States. That's a huge problem. The second part is cultural. I mean, America is not simply a nation in the Western Hemisphere. We are a planet. We are remote from the rest of the world. I mean, most Americans don't even understand what's happening down in the Yucatan Peninsula. If they can't figure out what's going on in the Yucatan Peninsula, what makes you think they can understand anything happening in Eastern Europe? We don't get it. And we have made no effort whatsoever to tell anybody anything that makes sense. And then finally, and this is cultural too, most Americans don't care what happens beyond their borders. The average person in Kansas City, Seattle, Washington, Des Moines, Iowa, they're worried about what happens where they live. They're worried about a job. They're worried about putting food on the table. They're worried about the influx of drugs into their community and how those are destroying the youth of the country. In other words, we're not this imperialist power that everybody makes us out to be. But the problem is that we have abdicated our control and responsibility to people in Washington. And the people in Washington have literally gotten away for 80 years with murder. They've been able to go to do pretty much whatever they want until the human losses make it impossible for them to continue. We left Vietnam when we'd lost almost 58,000 people killed and more than 100,000 wounded. And there was no evidence that we were achieving anything. Look how long it took us to figure that out. It took us, let's see, from 1965 really until 1969 to figure that out. But we did. And then when it was clear that we wouldn't support it, Washington backed down and we got out. Now, we were good for about almost 20 years, really until Desert Storm. And then subsequently, Desert Storm convinced lots of people in Washington that as long as you didn't take heavy casualties, you could invade whomever you wanted, bomb whomever you wanted, and challenge or threaten or bully whomever you wanted. And the average American would pay no attention. And I talk about the rise in this country of what I call the bombs away club. Well, we bombed Lower Slobovia last night. Hey, that's great, super. Where is it? Yeah, we're proud. We bombed somebody. You don't demonstrate your greatness as a nation, as a power, as a culture, as a people, by how much misery you inflict on others.
No, absolutely right. I think that you remind me of the great Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan, I think, called what you are saying Pax Americana.
Yes.
Instead of the Pax Romana, the Pax Americana, the imperialism that came when the United States saw itself as the only world superpower, back in the early 90s. Okay, the war is ours. We can do whatever we want. We can destroy, invade, do whatever. The whole world now answered to us. And that's so sad how things came, because nobody saw the rise of China, nobody saw the BRICS, nobody saw the resurrection of Russia, from the defeated Russia of Yeltsin to a more powerful, patriotic Christian country like Putin. And that's so sad that the American leaders are so blind to the realities of other world views and what's happening in the world. But sir, I know that you have to leave soon. So before you leave, I want to ask you, the whole world was in shock on October 7, the attacks on Israel. Over 1,000 people were killed. Terrorist act, obviously, we condemn that. Obviously, a lot of innocent people die, unarmed civilians die. That being said, we condemn that, obviously. My opinion, what I have seen from many analysts out there, and very courageous people who is saying it, is that the Likud party, in coalition with the ultra-Orthodox that are in power right now, Netanyahu and the ultra-Orthodox, are using October the 7 attacks, these horrific criminal attacks, terrorist attacks, as an excuse to carry out their plan, one of their strategic goals. And the strategic goals is creating this big Israel or greater Israel, of annexing the Gaza Strip, ethnic cleansing, or a push out of the way, making impossible civilian life over there, so they can take over, and later on they will do the same with the West Bank and perhaps part of Syria and perhaps part of Lebanon, whatever it takes, because they have in their mind this strategic goal since ever of creating the greater Israel. It's our duty, it's our ideological, philosophical, religious duty to create the greatest Israel. And they are doing their plan. And nobody's talking about that. I mean, very few people, perhaps Candace Owens, perhaps Tucker Carlson now very courageously, perhaps Representative Massey, perhaps he's talking, but nobody else is talking about this. What do you think about this insane bombardment? They attacked the only Catholic church in Gaza last week. There were 3 people killed. They are basically carpet bombing Gaza in a way that we haven't seen in decades, in years. What do you think about this strategic goal, the strategic aim of Israel, and why is the American media, why is the American politicians so afraid to say it, to talk to denounce these massacres that are happening? I think over 60,000 people, mostly civilian, obviously, children are being killed in front of our eyes in Gaza.
There is an increasing body of evidence being amassed that suggests, I would argue very conclusively, that the 7 October attack was allowed to happen. Israeli forces were specifically told between certain hours not to conduct patrols, and the intelligence received in the days and weeks leading up to it demonstrated very conclusively that an attack was imminent. And nevertheless, decisions were made that left the border weakly controlled and the Israeli population near Gaza vulnerable to attack. So that's first thing. Secondly, thanks to Max Blumenthal, Aaron Mate, and others, we now know that much of what was reported as having happened on 7 October was not true. Mass rapes, decapitation of babies, this sort of business. We also know that large numbers of Israeli citizens, even some soldiers, were killed as a result of fratricide. In other words, the Israeli Defense Force that finally does show up kills some of their own people. Now, there is a growing body of opinion that suggests that 7 October was allowed to happen so that this war for greater Israel, as you put it, could be triggered. And so we now see that that was probably the case. And as having been the case, Israel is trying to leverage its control of the United States Armed Forces and the government in Washington to achieve its aims in the region. Now, some of these aims overlap with financial interests in New York City and London, because those two banking centers are interested in trying to achieve against Iran what was achieved was not achieved against Russia. Remember, we talked about the strategy to rape Russia, to divide it, to strip it of its resources, to remove its government, and so forth. That has all failed miserably. No regime change is going to happen in Moscow. So now the attention has turned to isolating Iran and causing regime change there, and ultimately to divide Iran into smaller parts with the goal of gaining access to and control of the oil and gas reserves. Remember, Iran is probably 3 in the world in terms of oil and gas reserves. this this unfortunately is coinciding with the Israeli interest of completely eliminating the Palestinian population from its home on the so-called West Bank and in Gaza, which is justified on the basis of their inferiority, their criminality, their unwillingness to subordinate themselves to the Israelis. So you really have a war of Jewish supremacy being waged in the region. And you got to remember that the Israel lobby and the people that support it, the billionaires in the United States primarily, but not only, they are very interested in using us to subjugate the region to their interests, because the Israeli view is the Jews in Israel will never be safe until everyone who potentially represents a threat to them is either destroyed or subjugated. They can't do that on their own. They don't have the manpower, they don't have the resources or the military power to do that. Their principal instrument at this point is really the Air Force with over 300, 400 aircraft, and the Mossad. Those are the two principal instruments, because the Israeli army is quite small, and right now it has enormous problems with morale. Large numbers of people don't want to show up and fight anymore. They've taken more casualties than they admit. The situation is grim. So they're going to stay with this program, with this agenda of regional domination, and they're going to stay with it as long as they have control of us. This goes back to the New York City delegation in the White House and control of Congress. I don't know if you saw Mr. Netanyahu when he spoke to the U.S. Congress, but the man received numerous standing ovations. It was ridiculous. I mean, no foreign national has ever received those kinds of accolades. When Winston Churchill spoke to Congress, he did not receive those kinds of standing ovations. Well, why? It's because virtually everyone, in one way or another, is benefiting financially from supporting the Israeli agenda, which is the agenda, once again, of the larger financial community for the reasons I've already cited. So when will this end? I don't think it is going to end. I think it's going to continue as long as we are in their grip or grasp. And I don't see any evidence that that's going to change anytime soon. And the truth is, Mr. Trump is very much in their grip. He's made that very obvious. The thing that was surprising to many of us, and I'm sure you saw this, if you watched the Republican National Convention back in the summer of 2024, there was an event in which suddenly the wall was covered with the giant Israeli flag. There was a sign above it that said Israel first. And a rather plump gentleman walked out and started to lead cheers for Israel first. And all of us sort of sat there in kind of disbelief, because we had never seen the flag of any foreign country at a national convention. Now, we're used to seeing state flags, lots of American flags, but never a foreign flag. And the idea of Israel first is completely divorced from the notion of America first. But it went away. In other words, it happened, it went away. And I think a lot of us assumed, well, that's a payback to his wealthy donors who are, part of the Israel lobby, and it was over with. Well, we were wrong.
Go ahead, sir, but it's saying in your same point, I don't know, you saw, obviously you saw it, the Tucker Carlson interview with Ted Cruz, Senator Cruz, and Senator Cruz say it openly. I came to Congress to defend the United States and Israel, and defend United States and Israel were my goals, and that was my campaign talking point. And that's normal to us. It's normal to the American people that politicians go to Congress because they want to defend the United States and Israel. But what happened if I said I want to go to Congress to defend the United States and Argentina? I want to Congress to defend the United States and Belgium. People are going to look me strange. Why the United States and Belgium? Why the United States and Argentina? But it's completely normal for Congress, for about 80% of Congress people to say, I came here to defend Israel. And nobody, oh, that's normal. That's okay. Why are we so different from other countries in the world, like Europe, like the Holy See, like South America, like Asia? They all have a one vision, and it's not an isolated vision. It's the vision of the Holy See, of the Vatican. It's the vision of most of European countries. It's the vision of China. It's the vision of Russia. It's the vision, obviously, of the whole Arab Middle East. It's the vision of many countries in Latin America. But we are this entity apart from the rest of the world where 80%, 85%, I don't know how many of our congressmen openly say, I came to Congress to defend the United States and Israel. Why is that?
Well, I'm not aware of 85% of congressmen saying that. I mean, you may be right. And clearly, it has been very profitable if you're running for office to declare your support for Israel, because when you do that, you receive a gift of funds, money that helps to elect you. And you are also given access to other goodies, if you will, provided by the financial community. Now, people like me were always very supportive of Israel, and I have been in my lifetime, because I felt strongly, particularly in the aftermath of the Second World War, that Jews deserved a country where they could celebrate their Jewish culture and preserve their Jewish national identity. And I saw that as an essentially positive thing because of the potential contributions that Jews in that setting could make, not just to their own country, but to the world. Well, I was wrong. I never saw what was coming. I had not studied the Zionist history very well. What has happened is not something entirely new in the history of Zionism. It's actually been there for a long time. But I frankly never thought that it would go to the extent that it has in a place like Gaza. And certainly I cannot support the mass murder and expulsion of people from their homes anywhere. I don't care whether they're Jews or Muslims or Christians or Buddhists or Indians or Chinese. Doesn't make any difference. And I think we have to understand something. The people in Palestine living in Gaza, the Palestinians living on the West Bank, their people have been there for at least the last 1,000 to 2,000 years. There's a big difference between tossing people out that are poachers, in other words, illegals who came on board. They broke your laws, they moved into your country, they set themselves up. That's wrong. That can be dealt with harshly if necessary. But these people have been there for over 1,000 years. They live there. This is their home. This is not a solution in my judgment. It won't work. And I think more and more Americans are beginning to figure this out. And as they figure it out, all the money in the world that the Israel lobby can pour into the pockets of politicians is not going to be enough to justify that kind of inhumane behavior.
Sir, thank you very much for your time. I know that your time is very limited. I really appreciate it. I just want to finish with one comment of what you are saying. I have many friends here, and when I show them the letters that the Pope was sending back in 1943, 44, looking into Israel, the creation of the future state of Israel that came 4 years later, when I showed them the Holy See letters to the nuncio here in the United States, where they are completely against the formation of the state of Israel in Palestine, precisely because of the reasons you are saying. And to the contrary, they are pushing, they say if they want to create a home for the Jewish people, find another place. And places like Argentina came to mind. Places like South Africa came to mind. And I showed that to my Catholic friends here, and they are in this belief that even the Holy See, the Catholic Church at the time, in the 40s, they're completely against, because they knew, as you are saying, there were other people already living there for thousands of years. So that's something important that comes into place into understanding this issue. Colonel Dr. MacGregor, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much. You are a scholar, an expert in geopolitics, in military history, in military affairs. We are very honored to have you your time with us today. So we are really appreciative for your time. And sir, thank you very much once again.
Ron, thanks for inviting me, and God bless you and all your listeners.
Thank you, sir.